Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Osterhout, the executive producer here at Lincoln Square. And it's time again for our weekly conversation with the incredible Andra Watkins. Andra, how are you?
I'm great. How are you? How's everybody today?
Yeah, good. It's really cold where I am, and I don't like it anymore. I want it to not be this way.
Is it still snowing and terrible snow
it's
and
not,
ice?
it's not Well, so every single snowflake that came a week and a half ago is still sitting pristinely on top of every other snowflake because it has been really cold. Next week, it's supposed to get up to like 33, and we're all just eyeballing that date.
As a good day.
Yeah, we're gonna get our swimsuits on. We're gonna go outside and get some vitamin D. It's gonna be great. Well, today your work this week has been crazy, and we're still talking about the document "Saving America by Saving the Family," the 168-page document by Heritage Foundation that is meant to build America into a white Christian nationalist nation for the next 250 years. It's if Project 2025 were a plan that they will last for a quarter of a millennium. And we've been talking about it for the past few weeks, but I think what you've been writing about this week is so compelling because it extends from our lives, our how we spend our rest time, how we work, what we can purchase. And also we're seeing these effects on at-risk populations like the ones in Gaza already. This is where like the kook on the edge of town with the sign that says, the world is ending, meets reality, where you're like, oh, maybe he's not wrong. So right? I mean, it feels that way. This is the social credit stuff that we're going to talk about today. Social credits, all the kind of things. So I want to start with a quote from the document from Saving America by Saving the Family. And then we're going to tell you why you will not be able to purchase things on Sunday in the near future if they get their way. So a uniform day of rest that limits commercial activity can provide temporal boundaries that help communities to set aside time for religious observance. So let's talk about what's happening here.
All right. So the first reason that the Heritage Foundation and other white Christian nationalist extremists believe that heterosexual couples, which are the only people who would be allowed to get married in their America, aren't getting married and having as many babies as God gives them is because Americans have stopped going to church.
Right.
And they cite all of these self-produced numbers to back up the fact that Americans have stopped going to church in large numbers. They're bewildered as to why that has happened. So they blame an embrace of secularism instead of the fact that for the past 50 years, they have become more and more and more extreme and run people out of churches. Right. I don't want to have anything to do with a cult of, that wants to masquerade as Christianity that espouses what they do. And millions of other Americans feel that way. But, they can't blame themselves for destroying Americans going to church. So they blame secularism. And in this next section on community rest days and blue laws, they expand on that idea. So they start out in a really clever way in that section talking about blue laws. Now, you hear me, I've lived in the South of the U.S. all my life. So blue laws have always existed.
Right.
In my life. And even for you growing up in Kansas, they usually apply to things like alcohol and cigarettes and,
tattoos.
Vices. What?
tattoos in
Oh,
Oklahoma.
really?
I think that the law is still in the books. I hope somebody in the chat checks on this, that you can't get a tattoo on Sunday in Oklahoma because, it's in the Bible.
So, yeah, so it applied to things that the Bible considered to be vices, and it was kind of a thin regulation thing to have these blue laws where certain things couldn't be bought or sold or done on Sundays. So they reference that, and people immediately in their minds go back to this quaint time where they experienced those things or still experience them. But then they seg into something that I believe is more sinister, where they start talking about community rest laws. And they tie that back to the need for people to have a standardized communal day of rest so that they can go to church. That religious observance is so important and essential to the health of the country, and they use language like that. And so having a communal day of rest, and they point to a 1961 Supreme Court case that found that Sunday should be that day of rest. So the Christian day of rest is the one they want to make the national day of rest, this communal day of rest that's mandated. They point to other states and places that have these things. But the bottom line is they want a communal day of rest, a community day of rest that's mandated to be Sunday so that people can go to church and they can spend time with their families and they can rest.
Yep.
And that may not sound terrible. I mean, Americans are harried. We need some rest time. So, on the surface, that may not sound bad.
Look, I think this is a lot to unpack already. First, they say blue laws. That sounds quaint. It sounds old fashioned. And then it sort of rebrands to community rest laws, which still sounds sort of wholesome, pro-family. What it really means is mandatory church, surveillance, you track compliance, all of these kinds of things. But the thing that kind of gets me is that a lot of this goes back to just having babies, right? Because nothing puts me in the mood like going to church, right? Nothing makes me want love at home with my wife that like hearing a sermon from a white Christian nationalist preacher. So, I want to kind of go back to this, that their idea that Americans aren't having babies as much as they, the Christian nationalists want them to, because they aren't going to church is, if that were an SAT thing, it would be ridiculous, right? Like what do you call those? The analogy or whatever. It just doesn't make any sense. There's a whole wildly complicated reason why Americans aren't having babies at the rate that they used to, not least of which is, infant mortality is decreased. The economic benefit of having babies has decreased pretty wildly. You could make a very rational claim that not having a million kids is actually in our best interest, right? Having fewer children serves our personal interests. But that's where this gets weird, because the Christians don't care about our own personal interest, right?
Right. They constantly bemoan this place that we've come in this secular society where we have put the needs of adults over the needs of children. They don't call it needs of adults. They say desires of adults, which is a different thing. That makes it a selfish thing. You're going after things you want as adults for yourselves, and you're putting that ahead of the needs of children. And we need to stop that. So, later on in the document, and what I'll be talking about more next week is how they want people to not go to college, and they want people to get married younger and all of those things. But this setup of secularism has destroyed America and destroyed families and destroyed people having babies, even though the founders founded a secular government. That was the basis of our founding, that the separation of church and state was to protect the state from the church and not establish a religion and allow people the benefit of following their own minds and believing whatever they wanted and worshiping however they desired or not. So, but that secular government that our founders founded, they don't believe that happened. They don't believe the founders meant that, even though they did, and it's clear that they did. So they've attacked this notion of secularism. Then they complain for paragraphs about the fact that white Christian supremacy has been under attack. So, and that they call attacks on their religious freedom.
Right.
So they can't go around and tell everybody what the Bible says they should do anymore without getting told off about it. And that's, persecuting them, an attack on their religious freedom. So how they want to frame that is, we just need to go to biblical dominion where we make laws and we tell people what to do. So, and they will have to do it. So the next section then becomes a mandated communal day of rest.
Right.
Primarily so that people can go to church. And it's a throwaway sentence in the last part of that section. And that's why it's so important to read these documents and not cherry pick them. Because they talk about how when people start to form new communities and new planned areas, building in this mandated communal day of rest needs to be part of that.
Yep.
And where are we doing that right now on the planet?
I mean, this is where it gets really creepy because, this is not, and again, like I say this as, somebody who's skeptical of the guy on the outskirts of town with the sign. This news comes from, there's my bread machine. Sorry, if you can hear that.
I didn't hear it.
Okay, good. This news comes from The Guardian, that you make this striking connection between what's happening here and the planned communities in Gaza, which is wild. And it says Palestinians must, we're going to do a planned community in Gaza. It's going to be amazing. And Gazans, Palestinians will get food, they'll get education, they'll get water, they'll get healthcare. There's one catch, right? They have to submit to biometric documentation, and they have to enable identification, which is essentially not just like, they're not just tracking your phone, right? It's not just CCTV, like watching where you go. This is tracking you physically, biometrically. This is the thing that all of the QAnon quacks feared during COVID.
Right. And so, for the Heritage Foundation, which is funded by some of the techno-fascists who want to do these things and who have worked to make these things possible, like Peter Thiel, this kind of tracking ought to scare them to death. But this sentence being in there at the end of that section where they've said we need to mandate a communal day of rest, more people need to be going to church, and we need to build this into planned communities, and then they have a planned community that we can point to say this is how they're going to do that. So this can sound like a conspiracy theory to most people if they want it to, but to say, you're going to have to go to church and scan in biometrically every week, and if you want your bank account to keep working, doesn't sound so far-fetched when you knit all those things together.
Well, and we have folks like Peter Thiel and Palantir who are building a master database that combines tax records, immigration status, social security, bank accounts, medical claims. We have we have ICE agents in the street holding up cameras to people's faces. Why are they doing that? it's widely reported that they have facial tracking and facial recognition software. In fact, many protesters have said an ICE agent will walk up to them and call them by name. Mm-hmm. They know everything about us. We know nothing about them. They continue to have masks. This is really not about building a better life for us. It's about coercion and control for them, right?
Right.
Right. This took a real dark turn, by the way. I wanted to kind of just go back a little bit because I think this ties into what we're talking about now. Heritage says that community rest laws will cure something they call America's spiritual homelessness. Mm-hmm. And right, what I want to know, it feels like that's a sort of central thrust of everything that they do, right? This feeling that America has lost its spiritual center. And it's their job to force it back on us. What does spiritual homelessness mean in their context? Are we sick? Are we broken? What's happening?
One thing I didn't talk about in any of this series, so this gives me an opportunity to talk about it a little bit, is Christian nationalists believe that they worship the one true God, mm-hmm. and that all other religions are false. So therefore, when they're talking about spiritual homelessness, they're including people who would go to a mosque, people who would go to a synagogue, people who would, who would choose to stay home and sleep in on a Sunday because they don't practice any kind of faith, or people who want to go outside and take a walk because they're pagan and getting back to nature and being in nature makes them feel worshipful. But all of those things are not faith, really. They're not religion. So that is included in their definition of spiritual homelessness. When you drill even further down, the Heritage Foundation is funded by a bunch of Opus Dei Catholic extremists.
Yes.
And the Opus Dei Catholic cult believes that only Opus Dei Catholics are Christians, that Catholicism was the original Christianity. So when Roger Severino is talking about spiritual homelessness, he is even including Protestant Christianity in that definition for himself, because Opus Dei's goal is to bring back Christendom, which is Catholicism. So you have all of those things being built into a phrase like spiritual homelessness. And they intend with this document, with this proposal, which is just a policy position, but the regime has implemented how much? Over half of their other policy positions that I spent 2024 covering with Project 2025. So to dismiss it as just some wacky policy position from Roger Severino, a Christian nationalist extremist white man, is, I think, shortchanging what they really mean to do here. They believe that giving Americans too much freedom has allowed all of this to happen. And so what we need to do is force people back into these churches and into these high control environments. And, earlier you said going and sitting and listening to a white Christian nationalist pastor does not make me want to make a baby with my wife. But as someone who's been in one of those kinds of environments, the peer pressure that starts to come from not doing that eventually gets a lot of people to do that. If you're constantly asked every week, why aren't you getting pregnant? How are you trying to get pregnant? When are you going to get pregnant? I mean, on my wedding night for my first marriage, not even on my wedding night, at my reception, which was dry because it was in the church fellowship hall, we couldn't have alcohol.
Oh my God.
It was, people were asking me if I was going to get pregnant, trying to get pregnant on my honeymoon. Like they were expecting me to do that. Ugh. And more than one person brought it up. So They want people in these environments because they understand how this kind of peer pressure works and how you start being punished for not going along with what you're expected to do. It's one of the best ways that they think they can use to try to force more people to get married and have babies and stay married and not get divorced and all of those things. Because as I've said on this show many times, when you leave those environments, you lose your support structure. You lose everything you're familiar with. You lose, even in some cases, your family. So it's a very effective way of trying to force people to do what they want.
So, I think that I want to put a finer point on that, because you do lose the support structure, and I have sort of step family who came up in a very conservative church, and when they, like you, were like, wait a second, I don't, first husband, no, I can't, this is weird. They were excommunicated and they lost that support structure. And it was, they still feel that trauma to this day, 50 years later. The hurt and the pain that comes with that your family is like, you're no longer my family. Like, they would walk in a room and everyone would pretend that they weren't actually in the room with them. It's wild, the stories. But you may think out here in the audience that, not in this audience, because I know everyone in this audience is right along with us, but in, normie Christian, Methodist, Presbyterian, whoever, that this doesn't apply to you, but it does, because all we have to do is look back at Gaza, right? When people are at their lowest, they're starving, they have no water, they have no services, they have no health care. That is when these people come in and say, I'm going to take care of you, but, right? And so now we have to twist that to where we are now. Look at, and this may feel like a stretch at first, but go with me. We look at Minneapolis. They have roving thugs in the street who are literally terrorizing people. The testimonies in Congress last week were devastating from people who were victims of ICE. This is a terror campaign. And yet Tom Homan is saying, look, do you want us to be good to you? Just submit. Just don't protest. Like, what are you doing here? Like, maybe we wouldn't have to kill you or smash your windows or cut your seatbelts if you just went along with us. Right? That's the thrust that we're talking about here.
It's the same thing.
It's the same thing.
Yeah. And we can say all we want to, well, we're exceptional and that can never happen here. But it's been happening for, the history of our country is made up of this kind of behavior. Yes. These aren't the first concentration camps that have operated in the United States. Plantations were concentration camps. Yes. We have always had this problem in our country. So, just because it only happened to peoples of color out there somewhere where white people weren't impacted by it, didn't mean it wasn't happening. So, people in the Black community especially are right that, well, now you're seeing what we've always lived with.
Yeah. And
we have to acknowledge that as part of this. But also, we have to stand up and say no. This I hope this situation doesn't get to the place where they've just reduced a place like Minneapolis to rubble and turned it into another Gaza. But they've shown that they might be willing to do that. And so as a society, we have to prepare for what that means. As Americans, what does freedom really mean to us? What does democracy?
And like you mentioned, I experienced them in Kansas when I was growing up, and you couldn't buy booze on weekends or on Sundays, and there were other sort of weird quirks, like you couldn't say this word in this location, right? Like I worked at a head shop in college because of course I did, but the people would come in, and if they said, "Do you sell bongs?" I had to ask them to leave. Like they couldn't say particular words. They had to call it a water pipe, right? And that is, and we obviously, I thought it was stupid. It is, you're just replacing one word for another word. But that's just a very subtle means of control. You're policing that kind of language. And so an interesting thing that you wrote about this week was the fact that if blue laws affect mostly rural counties and towns, that there's a dry county, for example, and then on the border of that dry county are the most wonderful meccas of booze that you could ever imagine. It doesn't stop anyone from consuming or purchasing or taking part in that. And prohibition is, and you talk about prohibition, everyone, you have to go back and read Andra's work from this week. It's incredible. But the thing that really caught me is it feels like, imposing these blue laws as they really want to do now across the board is really a matter of rural white Christian nationalists owning the libs of American cities. Can you talk me through that a little bit?
Well, a lot of American cities don't have these kinds of prohibitions. They're urban areas that are diverse with many different backgrounds, many different cultures, many different faiths, many different ethnicities. And so, they're more melting pots. Minneapolis is a good example of that. Yeah. So, they don't tend to have these kinds of restrictive laws on Sundays where you can't buy alcohol at the grocery store or, whatever. So this is a way for these rural-based white Christian nationalists who've probably never been to Minneapolis or New York City or Chicago or any other urban area like that to say, we're going to tell you what to do, what you can and cannot do economically. To me, it's a way to control, for them to control blue areas' economies and punish their economies. They're doing that by terrorizing people also, and kidnapping and disappearing and murdering people in the streets and torturing people and all of that. But this would be another mechanism that they could use to say, we're going to tell you what businesses can and cannot exist, what businesses can and cannot operate on certain days or all days of the week. We're going to come in and tell you how these businesses have to be structured. And so, it's a much bigger thing when you really think about it than what they're presenting it as. And that's why I spent today just reviewing, it's easy to see the term blue laws and think, oh, I know what that means. But that's not really what they're proposing.
No.
They're proposing these community rest laws as a day, in my view, this is my opinion, where they control what everybody does all day long.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the only day they want to do that.
No.
The people in Gaza who want food and water and healthcare and education and housing, who have to give up all of their biometric data and be surveilled 24/7 like the Chinese that use WeChat, don't have the option to opt out of that. For people who don't know what WeChat is, it is a surveillance tool that the Chinese Communist Party uses to control their population. And social credits, which you said at the top of the show, comes from that system. That is their term.
Yeah.
And so you don't have the right as a Chinese person to turn off WeChat. You can't turn off the surveillance. You can't turn off your phone. You can't opt out. If you opt out for too long, they come along and say, what are you doing? And we're suspicious of you because you're not here. So we're going to ding you on some of your social credits. And that may mean you can't buy something you really want. That may mean you don't have access to your money for a certain number of days. But it can also mean you lose your job in China.
Yeah.
It can also mean, it can mean your children get kicked out of the school that's the preferred school that you got them into. So this is really what they're proposing with these community rest laws, in my opinion, which can sound like a hysterical, hyperbolic, crazy conspiracy theory. But, then you watch them attempting to do the same thing in Gaza.
Yeah, I think, you're gracious and you always say this is, in my opinion, and all this kind of thing. But you also, at the same time, one thing I love about you so much is that you provide all of the receipts. You say, this is my opinion. And here is the 258-page document where they told me exactly the things that I just told you. And this is how I arrived at my opinion, right? This is happening. And I think, we, in the age of cell phones and smartphones and big tech, especially in the early days of social media, we were like, well, this is kind of a privacy concern, but look what we get, who cares? And also, like, what do I have to hide? Right. And it feels like that slippery slope now that, I could get social credits, or I could get support, or I could get this if I'm just good. If I live a good, wholesome life. The problem is you don't get to decide what good means.
Exactly.
Somebody else decides for you. And also, because their definition of good comes from a biblical text that they are continuing to reinterpret every day according to their own fears and anxieties, you will never, ever know what it means to be good. You will always
having grown up in that, you will never be good enough.
Never. So let's talk about what we can do now. Do you have a couple of minutes?
I do.
Yay. So you always give action items, which I also really appreciate. You mentioned watching for politicians proposing new blue laws, getting documents, get your shit together before the SAVE Act passes. You also mentioned attending constitutional observer training.
Those are events that are happening in places. I'm increasingly Indivisible's running them across the country. But people in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and greater Minneapolis have been doing these constitutional observer trainings so that they can go and watch ICE and record ICE and document what they're doing. But it would be useful for Americans around the country to participate in those trainings and understand what their constitutional rights are when they go in to observe what these people are doing. So I did recommend that. And I know Indivisible is pushing those around the country. Yeah. So reach out to your local Indivisible chapter, or start one if you don't have one.
Start one. And what else? What's the most important thing we should do this week?
I think, it's a combination of factors. Alex Preddy's death and the regime's fumble of that dinged them quite a bit. But I think the past few days have shown that calling our representatives repeatedly and demanding they do what we want them to do, what we elected them to do, has merit and is important. We're seeing more cracks in the Republican side.
Yep.
And so when we start to see those things, when we get a win, like getting the DHS funding pulled out of a 6-bill package, we can't say, yay, we won.
Right.
We have to call even more. We have to let them know even louder that we expect them to work for us because we elected them.
Yeah, I think, Democrats, we have this sort of logical fallacy that a victory is the victory, right?
Yeah,
and we're up against people who see, who are publishing documents outlining the next 250 years,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think, part of our strategic sort of blind spot is that we understand the non-fixed nature of culture and society. And so the idea that we're going to create a society that will last for the next 500 years to, somebody like me is just absurd. It's like an absurd thing, because cultures evolve and societies evolve, and the, needs of people evolve by the week. So, but that's what we're up against. We're up against people who are making plans very, very long term, and they're very patient, although they're growing less patient.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think they've grown a lot less patient. And I think that's part of what this behavior is. I think they've rolled out some things sooner than they wanted to. And we can take advantage of that. One of the things that I'm trying to do in my own life is say, democracy is not a given. What have I done today to take care of democracy? Because it is a daily job.
Yes.
And so, it doesn't have to be something big every day. It doesn't have to be a heavy lift every day. But every day, look at yourself in the mirror and say, what have I done to protect and defend democracy today? And then pick something and do that.
And I know, just to sort of kind of start to put a cap on this, people like Scott Galloway are really proposing, unsubscribes and all of this. And last week we saw, the Washington Post in the sort of death throes. It's alarming, and I think that one of our the Washington Post situation really reminded me how absolutely essential an informed public is. And so your primary civic duty is to be informed. That's the very first thing that you have to do. You have to be informed. If you're not informed, everything is moot, right? It's just, it doesn't matter.
The death of the Washington Post is a projection of what Americans value.
Yes.
So, enough Americans didn't value deep investigative journalism enough to pay for it. So an awful oligarch came in and bought it and dismantled that, because many Americans would rather be told what they want to hear instead of informed. They'd rather be entertained instead of informed. And so it's really vital to support outlets like Lincoln Square and me, who I don't show up every day and say, what do my readers want to hear today?
Right.
I am going through documents like this one, which isn't fun and isn't great, but it is necessary so that people can be informed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you're doing too at Lincoln Square. So it's important to support these kinds of things, or they will go the way of the Washington Post.
Yes. Yeah. And look, I think, and, I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but media exists as a means of filtering out all of the noise so that you can take essential facts and stories and then make your own decision. Without media, you are left to sort through all of the chaos on your own, right? Right? Mm-hmm. There are things that our brains just do and ignore, and so that we can survive, because there's a lot coming at you every second of every day. Some things are just automatic. Media does that for you. So that's an important thing. And on that note, I just want to hear what this coming week, what are you going to focus on?
Tomorrow I'm going to lecture people. The values thing was a preview, because I'm going to ask people to boycott the Super Bowl. Yes. But next week,
the Super Bowl is today as you're watching this. We're taping on Thursday.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask people to do that. But then next week, I'm picking back up with more reasons why white Christian nationalists believe Americans aren't getting married super young and having as many babies as God gives them. And it gets even darker.
Oh,
So, it'll be fun. I get to talk about pornography again. I spent
oh,
so much time in 2024 writing about and telling people white Christian nationalists believe everything is pornography. So we
yeah.
get to go back to that.
Oh man, I can't wait. Next Sunday, I'm going to go to church. I'm going to talk about pornography, and I'm going to make a whole bunch of babies. It's going to be a white Christian nationalist dream. Oh my God. Well, Andra, I really appreciate you. Everyone subscribe to For Such Time as This. It's really an amazing read. And we will see you next week.
Bye, everybody.